Sometimes the coincidence of circumstances seems so strange, as if the police are not protecting the citizens but supporting dangerous criminals, including repeat offenders. How else can one explain the story of today's criminal? At the beginning of 1976, in La Grange, a small town in the state of Illinois, USA, there lived a girl named Pamela Maurer. She was a 16-year-old teenager. She lived with her parents in a suburb. The girl was one of 4 children in the family. Pamela had a completely normal childhood in a loving family on a farm, surrounded by nature and loved ones. A warm relationship developed among the children. They spent their free time together, went for walks in the area, and went canoeing. She was described as a shy and quiet girl. In new social settings, she was usually silent, but it was worth getting to know her better because Pamela revealed her best qualities. She was friendly, had a good sense of humor, and was intelligent. Today, one would describe her as an introvert, but that did not prevent her from being friendly and very positive. According to her parents, there were never any problems with her. She was the quietest and most obedient of all the couple's children. Even during her teenage years, when she should have been rebellious, she was much calmer than many other teenagers. Pamela always avoided bad company, never hung out with unruly kids. She was the kind of child from whom one expected the least trouble, problems, and certainly not the horrors that befell her. In 1976, Pamela was in her final year of high school. She handled the curriculum well, often went out with friends, and had fun. It was the same on a Monday in January when the 16-year-old met with her friends in a neighboring house after school, which was not far from her parents' property. Similar meetings took place almost daily. The teenagers chatted and watched TV together. Toward the end of the evening, Pamela told her friends that she would go to the store to get a lemonade. Considering the time, she wanted to go to the local laundromat where there was a vending machine or to a nearby McDonald's, but she didn't say where she was going. In any case, it wouldn't take longer than 10 minutes because both shops were not far away. The student left the house around 9:45 p.m. and intended to return soon, as she had promised to be back with her parents by 10 p.m. However, the girl was delayed. Around 10 p.m., the other teenagers began to worry because it was curfew. All shops were closed, and she should have long been on her way home. Unfortunately, there were no mobile phones at that time, so none of her friends could quickly reach her to find out why she was late. Instead, the friends called her home, where her parents told them that she had not yet arrived. At the same time, the mother and father thought that their daughter was at a friend's house. Given the time, they were worried, especially since they knew the temperament of the teenager. Pamela was neither inclined to run away from home nor to make spontaneous decisions without perhaps telling her family about it. But her mother and father pulled themselves together. They decided to wait a little longer and not to spread panic immediately. The parents hoped that the girl would soon appear and give an explanation for her lateness. After all, they lived in a quiet small town where there had never been a crime, so they believed in the best. Her mother and father went outside, looked around, and waited for her on the porch. But even after 11 p.m., Pamela was still not there. Then the parents called the teenagers in the house where she had been that evening. It turned out that the girl had still not returned since she had gone to the store. It had been over an hour. The parents left the other older children alone at home, grabbed a few friends of their missing daughter, and began searching the local streets by car. Naturally, they were particularly interested in the McDonald's and the laundromat that her friends had told them about. They went there and asked if the girl had had a lemonade there. Unfortunately, they could neither find the missing girl nor any trace of her. They drove around the entire neighborhood, called all of their daughter's acquaintances, but no one had seen the missing girl. It was as if she had vanished. On the same day, shortly before midnight, Pamela's mother went to the police. The woman reported the disappearance of the 16-year-old. Despite the seriousness of the situation, which the parents were aware of, the police officers were skeptical. It was a teenager who was out with friends, which made the officers skeptical. They believed the girl had gone on a drinking spree, had lost track of time, and would return later. Although the mother assured them that Pamela was always very calm and responsible and could not be late for curfew, the policemen did not listen to the woman. They all believed that Pamela had simply run away from home and insisted that the student would soon return home. The officers insisted that it would be better for the mother to go home and wait for her daughter there. While they were driving around the city, Pamela might already be back and they would be wasting their time. But the mother had the feeling that something bad had happened to her daughter, but no one wanted to listen to her. To reassure the worried parents, the local police sent several men to patrol the streets. They drove through the neighborhood and searched, but found nothing. Pamela's parents, of course, did not find their daughter at home either. Her siblings had no idea where the missing girl could have gone. She hadn't told them anything about her plans. All the teenagers' belongings were still there, confirming their worst fears. It was winter, and the area often had heavy snowfalls. Outside, it was very cold and often windy. If a girl, for example, fell and found no shelter, she could freeze to death. But even that was not the frightening part. The mere fact that she had disappeared seemed suspicious. The mother feared that violence had been done to her. We did not have to wait long for news. On January 13th of the same year, a road worker was on the country road. On the roadside, he saw a suspicious object, which upon closer inspection turned out to be a woman's handbag. Behind it lay the body of a girl. The worker was shocked and reported the gruesome find to the police. When the police officers arrived at the crime scene, they found an ID in her jacket. It was Pamela Maurer. She was lying face down on the roadside in the snow and was fully clothed except for one of her boots. It was found on the side. When the police arrived, the body was practically frozen, which meant that she had been lying there for several hours. It was assumed that she might have been hit by a car, but how could she have been there at all? That was inexplicable. But the clue was right under the investigators' noses. A kind of broken rubber hose was found next to the body, but this was initially overlooked. After an autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the cause of death was strangulation with a hose-like object. It immediately became an important piece of evidence in the case, but such a hose was very popular and sold in almost every hardware store. Given the circumstances at the time, it was almost impossible to determine where exactly this object had been purchased. According to the medical examiner, death occurred between 10 p.m. and midnight. This suggests that the high school student was attacked at the very moment when she left the house alone to get a lemonade. There were also signs of sexual assault on the body. The car accident had nothing to do with it. She was apparently attacked, raped, then strangled, and left on the roadside. After this finding, the police initiated a formal murder investigation. The big problem was the fact that the crime scene had been disturbed. In the snow, it was almost impossible to recognize the footprints of the real perpetrator. Initially, all footprints were disregarded, as it was assumed that the girl had been hit by a car. Moreover, it was the 70s when modern forensic techniques and DNA analyses were still comparable to science fiction. In fact, the police had no material to work with. Law enforcement authorities had no choice but to look for the likely perpetrator in the immediate vicinity of the victim. The person who found the body was questioned and released. Pamela's boyfriend was questioned, a young man named L, who denied any involvement in the murder. It turned out that he was not in the company of the teenagers that evening, as his mother did not let him go to the meeting. He had spent the whole evening at home doing his homework. The woman confirmed this. Although her words seemed to be solid confirmation of his innocence, the investigators did not rule this out due to lack of other leads and decided to get to know the young man better. It was not excluded that the mother was covering for the perpetrator, and suspicion intensified after the high school student requested a lawyer. At this point, it seemed unusual that he was no longer cooperating with the authorities, especially since it was about his girlfriend. He was closely watched for some time. Eventually, the man was removed from the list of suspects. He was clearly not involved in Pamela's murder. The police checked one of Pamela's acquaintances after another. All were gradually excluded. They began checking sex offenders who might have been in the city or even in the state at the time, but they were also ruled out. The public became actively involved in this work because rumors about the student's murder spread like wildfire. Every day, people who were not indifferent contacted the police station and gave various tips. One of these tips was an anonymous hint that the police should take a closer look at the 29-year-old B. According to the witness, he heard the young man talking in a local bar where he confessed to killing Pamela. The man actually seemed to be a suitable candidate. He had a long criminal record. Moreover, he worked at a gas station. It was located near the laundromat where the girl had gotten a lemonade. The same gas station had a maintenance department and a small counter with household goods. Among the goods were exactly the hoses with which the teenager had been strangled. When the young man was arrested, he pleaded not guilty and emphasized that he did not know who Pamela was. He had not committed serious crimes and had no previous convictions for sexual assaults. But the investigations revealed that he fit the crime against Pamela. The suspect agreed to take a lie detector test. Michael passed it easily, but he was not removed from the list of suspects. The accuracy of the lie detector is not very high. It does not provide a 100% guarantee of his innocence. Nevertheless, there were no valid reasons for an arrest, and the young man was released. All investigative approaches ran into the sand. All calls to the station and tips led to a dead end. Finally, the police had to go back to work. All this was a heavy blow for the Maurer family. Not only did the death of the girl remain unavenged, but a criminal who was capable of such a brutal murder was still at large. Unfortunately, law enforcement authorities had no choice but to hide the Pamela Maurer case in the archives until better times came. This situation lasted for decades until a turning point came in the year 2000. At that time, there was a technological breakthrough in forensic science, and innovative DNA testing methods were developed. Finally, the police got to the bottom of Pamela's murder. It was decided that the technical possibilities now would allow a new look at the circumstances of the brutal massacre of the schoolgirl. Given the time frame, the investigators did not have much material to examine. This included the clothing the deceased was wearing at the time of the rape and murder, as well as a hose that was presumably the murder weapon. The most important physical evidence were the DNA samples of the murderer that might have been left behind. It worked. Clear traces were found on Pamela's clothing. The authorities now had in hand a profile of the man who had raped and murdered the teenager. But despite all hopes, after a comparison with the database of already known criminals, there was not a single match. The collected material was even compared with the main suspect in this case, Michael Boss. Although he was already dead at the time of the comparison, he was checked. Even with the main suspect from the 70s, there was no match with the DNA profile. Despite all hope, the case again ended in a dead end. Practically all investigators involved in the search for the perpetrator had given up. But not Chris Loudon. When Pamela died, he was, by his own account, the same age as her. He vividly remembers the fear that gripped him and the panic that prevailed in the community. The incident had settled in his heart for the rest of his life. Chris enrolled in the police academy, worked at the station, and hoped all these years to contribute to solving Pamela's case. He was angry that the perpetrator could get away unpunished again and swore to solve the case. Investigator Chris Loudon began working on the case in March 2019. By this time, 43 years had passed since the violent death of the teenager. Together with several other investigators, he decided to apply a new method called DNA phenotyping. With this technology, a portrait of the probable owner of the genetic material can be created. To realize this idea, law enforcement authorities turned to the Parabon Laboratory, which works in this area. After analyzing the material, the company's employees found that the suspected murderer had green eyes. This information alone was already important, as only 2% of the U.S. population have eyes of this color. In addition, a probable portrait of the owner of the DNA sample was created. With the help of genetic genealogy, the lab began to create a family tree of the perpetrator. And in this way, several people could be identified who were related to the owner of the DNA sample. It could be calculated that the murderer most likely had the surname Lindahl. The investigators then searched for men who lived in DuPage County in 1976. They managed to find two brothers with the surname Lindahl, one of whom actually had green eyes. Of the two, he was the younger. His name was Bruce. A photo of this man was found. He actually had a great resemblance to the image from the DNA phenotyping. Moreover, Bruce Lindahl lived in the area at the time of Pamela's disappearance. Bruce Lindahl was born on January 29, 1953, in the city of St. Charles, not far from the place where Pamela was raped and murdered. At the time of the crime, he was 23 years old, 7 years older than his victim. According to the memories of his acquaintances and classmates, he was already considered extremely aggressive and tried to stay away. In his school days, Bruce was known for scaring girls and behaving inappropriately towards them. One of the women contacted was acquainted with Bruce in her youth. She recalled a rather creepy incident. The name of the witness was Terry Cooper. She had once confronted Pamela's probable murderer at a bowling alley. He had insisted that she ride home with his car, as his car was already in the parking lot. Naturally, the girl refused. However, when she went to the parking lot and tried to start her car, it wouldn't start for a long time. All the while, Bruce stood by her side and urged her to ride in his car. It seemed as if he could barely contain his anger. Eventually, Terry managed to start the engine, which only fueled Lindahl's anger even more. Fortunately, this time there were no injuries, but the girl later remembered that Bruce insisted on persuading her to ride with him. He followed her. Terry is still convinced that Bruce deliberately did something to her car back, then to prevent her from starting the engine. After learning of his alleged connection to Pamela's murder, she was even more frightened. She realized that she too could have become a victim of a violent man. Apart from the incident with Terry, there was another strange incident. The older brother got into an argument with the 20-year-old Bruce when he caught him trying to force a strange girl into his car. He freed the victim, whereupon Lindahl Jr. became furious. Bruce attacked them both. The girl was able to escape, but the brother was less fortunate. The maladjusted man inflicted such injuries on his older brother that his face had to be stitched 11 times. When the police heard about these stories, they were sure that it was an unstable person who could not accept no. It became clear why the DNA did not show up in the databases of police and intelligence agencies. Bruce had never come under serious suspicion. His DNA was not in the system. A complete investigation of the man's background was necessary. After an argument with his brother, he went to college. Here, Bruce managed to obtain a degree in electromechanics. The man got a job as an electrician, then changed jobs several times, which did not prevent him from continuing his criminal past. In the next years, he was repeatedly arrested for various minor offenses, such as possession of illegal substances. Nevertheless, the notorious criminal managed to escape imprisonment every time and get away with small fines. While reviewing Bruce's biography, the investigators found that he was a dangerous repeat offender who had raped several women by March 1979. It became known that he had lured the 20-year-old Annette Lazar to his house under the pretext of selling substances. Instead of carrying out the deal, he attacked her with a pistol and raped her. By a miracle, the victim was able to escape. Annette immediately turned to the police, but since she was a drug addict, her report was ignored. Moreover, Bruce was renting a room at that time in the house of a good friend of his who turned out to be a policeman. Probably, the acquaintance with this man helped him avoid trouble with the law. Nevertheless, Bruce's violent character kept showing. Sometime later, he was stopped on the street by patrol officers. They wanted to carry out a normal check, but to their surprise, they found a girl unconscious inside the car. She was bleeding from the head. To the officers' questions, Bruce said he had picked up the injured woman and was taking her to the hospital. Although the medical facility was in the other direction, the young man gave a quite plausible explanation for the incident. He said he had been at a party with the girl. She had had a few drinks too many, had fallen, and hit her head. They believed him. Bruce was released without bothering to check his story. The girl was never found and may even have been murdered. Other girls were found. They all claimed that Bruce had forced them at gunpoint into intimate relationships or threatened to kill himself. He had drugged them with illegal substances, then undressed them and taken Polaroid photos. Usually, they were minors. The most shocking case associated with Bruce occurred 4 years after Pamela's death, in June 1980, in the parking lot of a shopping center in Aurora, Illinois. He attacked Deborah Toller. Bruce approached her in the parking lot and complained that he could not start his car's engine. The young man asked to sit in the driver's seat and step on the gas. Deborah was accompanied by a friend, and they felt safe. In those days, there was hardly any talk about crime, and it seemed as if nothing bad happened in their area. So the girls agreed to help the stranger, which was a fatal mistake. Before the eyes of her friend, as soon as the girls approached, Bruce pushed the frightened Deborah into his car and drove off with her to an unknown location. He took the terrified Deborah to his house, used some ropes tied like a collar to drag her into the house like a dog. Here, Bruce held the hostage and repeatedly raped her before the victim managed to escape. After escaping, the captive went directly to the police and reported the kidnapping and rape, giving them his address and car. Bruce was eventually arrested and charged with the crimes, but was able to be released on bail and was awaiting a trial scheduled for 1982. Unfortunately, the trial never took place. The fact is that Deborah suddenly disappeared on her way home from work just 4 months after the assault. She had no protection and was an easy target. Bruce was at that time at home on bail. Apparently, she was harassed by her tormentor, who simply silenced her. For some reason, the police did nothing. Since there was no main witness in the rape case, there could be no trial, and so the dangerous criminal was simply released. The body was discovered 4 years later in a shallow grave in a field near Oswego, Illinois. The cause of death was never established, as the body was in poor condition. It was hard to say whether Bruce killed her himself or whether he hired someone to do the dirty work. Both seemed plausible. Investigators were now able to find witnesses who reported that Bruce had indeed offered to commit murder for money. The investigations became impossible when Bruce died in April 1981 at the age of 28. The circumstances of his death are indeed remarkable. Bruce accidentally fatally injured himself while trying to kill another man. On April 4, 1981, he was driving his car through the city of Naperville, Illinois. He happened to come across an 18-year-old young man named Charles Huber. The investigations at the time revealed that the two had not known each other before this encounter. Nevertheless, the repeat offender invited the stranger to go bowling. Charles agreed, but after a few games, Bruce persuaded him to come to his house for a beer and a chat. Instead of a quiet, friendly evening, Bruce grabbed a knife and suddenly attacked Charles, stabbing him 28 times. The young man died as a result of this uncontrolled aggression. It is known that Bruce had a penchant for raping and torturing women, so these events with the sudden attack on Charles do not fit his usual habits. What led to such a drastic deviation remains unclear. There were no signs of sexual overtones between the two. In one way or another, a fight ensued. Charles put up fierce resistance. During the struggle, Bruce accidentally stabbed himself in the femoral artery. The 28-year-old fiend died next to his latest victim from blood loss. The murder of Pamela was almost solved, but the news of the death of the main suspect was a great disappointment for the investigators who were trying to bring justice to the victim. The probable murderer had died 38 years before the resumption of the investigation. The only thing the police could do was obtain Bruce's DNA and compare it with the material found on the items of the murdered woman. In this way, they could at least set the record straight and prove who the murderer was. But, of course, there were no DNA samples in Bruce's file because he had died before forensic analysis was integrated into police work. To conduct a comparison, Bruce's body had to be exhumed, which could happen in the same year, 2019. In January 2020, The results of the analyses were available. The DNA sample showed a 100% match. Based on the previous attacks, the investigators reconstructed a rough picture of the events. In the late evening, Bruce saw Pamela, who set out alone in the twilight to get a lemonade. The villain followed the victim in his car, drove up to the girl, lured or forced her into the car, and drove a bit out of town. He raped and strangled the student so that she would not tell the police about him, and then threw the body on the roadside. At that time, there was no DNA forensics, so he did not even bother not to leave his traces on her. With his other victims, including Deborah, he used approximately the same technique. The investigators believe that there were many more victims. 44 years after these gruesome events, the parents of the 16-year-old Pamela finally learned the name of their daughter's murderer. Of course, this was a small comfort in light of the fact that he can never be punished for his evil deed. But the work of law enforcement was not yet finished. Obviously, it was a serial rapist or even a murderer who could have further victims. The investigators began searching the archives of unsolved cases with similar crimes. One of his victims could have been a 16-year-old girl named Deborah McCall, who was a high school student at the time of her disappearance. On November 5th of the 70s, she left school and went home but has not been seen since. It was suspected that she could have been one of the victims. There were many similarities with Pamela Maurer. Both were the same type, attended the same school, lived in the same neighborhood where Bruce was active. Photos of the young Deborah were found in the murderer's house. This was a clear confirmation of his involvement. Unfortunately, the girl's body was never found. There is no evidence against the perpetrator, and the only person who could point to it with certainty is no longer alive. It is very likely that Bruce will be held responsible for at least 4 murders. The police found numerous photos of other frightened, underage, naked girls who were taken with a Polaroid camera during captivity. These pictures were found in a shoebox in Bruce's apartment, and now the police are trying to find out if any of these girls are victims of an unsolved crime. There is progress in this direction. Some of the girls are indeed no longer alive. Others are missing, but there are still no clues. The police continue to receive reports of Bruce's involvement in other crimes. In the meantime, more than 75 women have come forward stating that they were raped by him. Fortunately, they survived but were severely injured and traumatized. Most of them stated that he stalked them in shopping centers, then raped and filmed them. The investigations against him are not yet completed. Thanks for watching and take care of yourselves.